Election College Episode 30, Andrew Johnson, Reconstruction, and a bunch of disagreements. In this episode, Lincoln is dead, Johnson becomes president, and the country tries to recover from war.
Let's throw a political party. Face it, the political scene sucks, but did it always? It's time for Election College, and class is in session. Now, your hosts, Jason Goff and Ben Smith.
So, Jason, it's April 15th, 1865, and yesterday, President Lincoln was shot in Ford's Theater.
Yeah, Ben, and before we get into it, as expected, we've gotten some feedback this week about our episode about the assassination of the president. And, of course, there are differing accounts of what actually happened.
Yeah, and we knew there'd be some things like that. I think we even mentioned it. But what we do know is that there was a plot to kill not only the president, but also William Seward, the Secretary of State, and Vice President Andrew Johnson. And we talked about this a little bit, but let's go ahead and dive in. Let's talk about Seward for just a moment.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy, Ben, because Lewis Powell, he was a 20-year-old Confederate soldier, and he was selected as the guy who was supposed to kill Seward, the Secretary of State. So Seward had just been injured in a carriage accident pretty severely a week before the attempt.
Yeah, and so he's got this broken jaw, and he's got this metal splint hanging around his neck. And his injuries, there were so many that he had to be confined to bed for a few weeks. And come to find out, if somebody wants to kill you, being stuck in bed is not the luckiest place you can be.
Right. So this guy, Powell, he shows up at the secretary's house, and he's like, hey, I'm from the pharmacy and I've got some medicine and I need to bring the medicine directly to the patient himself.
So the butler lets him in because who's a man to deny someone from getting their medicine, right?
Of course.
He goes upstairs, not the butler, Powell, and forces himself into Mr. Seward's sick chamber. He had gotten some conflict on the way in, and then he wounds the secretary's son, Frederick. He wounds the nurse along the way, and then he forces himself upon Seward and stabs him 3 times in the throat and twice in the face, which does not sound like fun. And they actually say that probably the only reason that he didn't get dead was that the secretary didn't get dead was because of this metal jaw brace he had on, and that really just protected him from being dealt the final blow.
Yeah, and Ben, this guy Powell, he just goes ballistic. I mean, he's stabbing everyone. You can imagine, if you've got a gun, boom, it's done. But I mean, he's got. I just picture him with these knives or whatever, and he's just going nuts. He stabs the guy on the way out, and that guy ends up being paralyzed. But believe it or not, I think there were 6 people, and nobody died.
Yeah, he's basically, I think, what we can call the most ineffective assassin ever to act. And I've also heard it said that you have to be a sociopath to be a murderous killer, but it's even worse if you use a knife instead of a gun, because like you said, a gun, you're done. A knife, you have to physically and injure the person. So yeah, not a nice guy.
Yeah. So Seward survives, and several family members, they're injured and friends. But he goes on, and he'll be part of our story later on even. So, the vice president, there was supposed to be an assassination attempt on his side too.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll have a crazy story about how he narrowly avoided death with a neck brace or something like that, right?
No, this is even better.
Oh, okay. All right.
So George Atzelrod, I think we mentioned him in passing.
Mm-hmm.
He's a German immigrant, and John Wilkes Booth himself actually assigned him to kill Andrew Johnson. So on the evening of April 14th, Atzelrod, not Atzelrod, but Atzelrod, he stayed at the same place as Johnson. But get this, he couldn't muster up the courage to kill him.
Yeah, he's in the hotel bar and he's drinking heavily, and then he just walks the streets of Washington drunk. And it kind of, I know it wasn't, but it'd be kind of interesting if the guy who was supposed to be guarding Lincoln's booth, or box, I guess I should say, because, booth confuses people in this scenario.
Right.
But if the guy who was there and they said that he went to drink, if they were like sitting there drinking next to each other, he and Atzelrod.
Yeah.
That'd be fun. I know it wasn't actually the same bar, but anyway. So Atzelrod asked the bartender, "Hey, where's Andrew Johnson?" And after Lincoln's death, this causes a lot of suspicion, obviously, and he's wondering why it's going on, so they catch him.
So during his trial, get this, Ben, his attorney says that Atzelrod was such a constitutional coward that if he had been assigned the duty of assassinating the VP, he could never have done it. And that from his known cowardice, Booth probably did not assign to him any such duty.
Yeah, that's... I would be a little bit offended if that was said of me, I think.
So you got people thinking, hey, this guy is a murderer. Some people saying, hey, this guy is a drunk. And others saying, oh, he's a coward. And It turns out that he's all three.
Uh-huh.
And he ends up getting hanged anyway.
Yeah, not a great scenario for him, but probably worked in the best interest of the country at the moment.
Yeah, he didn't really live up to that quote of Lincoln. Didn't he say, whatever you do, be good at it?
Right.
Yikes.
Yeah, you don't have to do something you don't want to do, but if you're going to do it right. So then, all this builds up to the fact that, first, Andrew Johnson's still alive. He didn't die. And two, Abe Lincoln, Honest Abe, is dead now. He was assassinated. So what happens next?
Yeah. So hours later, Johnson is sworn in as president. And there's actually some conspiracy theories out there about Johnson being involved with the plotting to kill the president. But I mean, really, we could go off on how many conspiracy theories out of this. So we'll just stick with the fact that, okay, Johnson becomes president and he's got several goals for Reconstruction.
Yeah. And I think even for conspiracy theories, I somewhat follow and believe as far as presidential stuff goes, or really anything else that might come up in this show. For the sake of the show, I'm kind of going to always lean towards the official statement that's not a conspiracy, for the sake of this is what everyone says. But we all know there's some goofy stuff that happens out there. So anyway, Johnson has these 3 goals for Reconstruction, and he's already off to a bad start with the Senate and already off to a bad start with his cabinet, that he pretty much just says to the cabinet who's already there for Lincoln, all right, just come on over. We'll just start with you guys and see how it works out. So he gets inaugurated or brought into office, swears in, and he's like, all right, I got 3 goals during this Reconstruction phase. And I don't know if he actually said that, but we know he had these 3 goals. Yeah.
So he was all about getting the southern states back on good standing with the rest of the Union. So he's like, hey, let's get these states restored. Hey, guess what? They never left the Union. And really, they should be recognized as loyal citizens. Get the good guys to form a government, and this is great. Now, Johnson said that AfricanAmerican suffrage was a delay and a distraction, and that it always had been a state's responsibility to decide who should vote. So, I'm just going to call it like I see it, and I think it's pretty cowardly.
Yeah, it's definitely pretty cowardly. And part of that he was pretty outspoken about that. He was a Southerner, but they did bring him in to a Northerners' race for the president, into Lincoln's race. And they even said, like, the reason we're bringing him in is because he's a Southerner and we want some support from down there. So it's really interesting to me that with the position he took, that Booth wanted him dead so badly, because he's almost more of a benefit to the South than he is to the North.
Right.
Because he just doesn't take a stance on it and says it's states' rights, and that's what the South's like. That's what we've been saying the whole time.
Right.
It's our decision.
Yeah, and you think about it, okay, hindsight's 2020, but it was genius of Lincoln to have Johnson be his vice president. He really needed a Southern Democrat on the party ticket, but Lincoln, of course, isn't thinking at the time, oh, I could be assassinated and this guy could actually become president. So
right, no one really ever is.
Yeah. So let's go back to the 3 points here. The second thing that Johnson really wanted to do was to get political power in the southern states, that power should not be in the hands of the elite, but which would be called the planter class, but really should go into more of that middle of the road economically, the plebeians, right?
Right.
So Johnson feared that the freedmen, many of whom were still economically bound to their former masters, they might vote at their direction.
Right. Yeah. And part of the issue here is that he, one, doesn't really want them to vote because he thinks that it should be states' rights. So if it's states' rights, they're not going to choose for the freedmen to be able to vote if they have the option. And if they do, he's fearful that they're going to listen to the rich dudes instead of the common man. So all around, he's just trying to work the system so that the common man has the upper hand here.
Yeah. And so Johnson has this 3-pronged goal sheet. He's got this little checklist out.
Yeah.
He probably had a Palm Pilot back then, right?
Yeah. Well, I think Palm was a little later.
Okay, just a little bit later. Okay, well, the third thing on his checklist was, hey, 1868 is going to be coming around before we know it.
Mm-hmm.
I want to win.
Yeah, before this, I didn't even know I wanted to be the vice president, and now I'm president, and I want to stay that way.
Yeah, so a little bit of background.
Andrew Johnson, not always getting along with the Senate and the House, and they're not always best buds. There's a couple times where he actually tries to enact different things, and the Senate's like, no, you're probably not going to do that. All right, I guess it was the House, right? I always get confused which gets to decide first. Congress, in some way, shape, or form, says about multiple things, we don't want you to do that, so we're going to veto we're going to pass something, you're going to veto it, and we're going to overrule you anyway. And so there's just this constant back and forth between Johnson and Congress where they don't get along so well.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the political parties, because that's really what was going on in Congress. You had the radical Republicans, and I think most of us would say, well, why even say that they're radical? Because in our day and age, we view slavery as just an abomination. But really the only party at that time that was standing for, hey, African Americans are, let's just face it, they are 100% human beings, and they were not treated as such. And really, the radical Republicans were the only party at this time, only major political party at this time, who were saying, yes, they are free, they are full citizens, that they have the right to vote, or they should have the right to vote. And come on, let's move past this.
So, obviously at the time, well, maybe I'm wrong on this, but I think they didn't call themselves radical Republicans. They just called themselves Republicans. But they were split into two factions, radical and moderate. And so you've got these moderate Republicans as well, who are pretty much just want to keep the Democrats out of power, and they don't want the former rebels, or maybe they thought they were still rebels, I don't know, to resume their power. And so they were just like, they were not enthusiastic at all about African Americans, or I guess they weren't African Americans at the time. They were considered black people because they weren't considered American yet. But at any rate, they didn't really care so much about suffrage, not like the radical Republicans did. And there could be multiple different reasons for that. It could be political concerns. They could be persuaded that anybody who was a freedman would be likely to cast his vote badly, which one comes from a point of view that they're not educated, which they weren't technically educated, but not that they weren't intelligent. It also opens up the realization to me now here in 2015 that, well, if you don't want them to vote badly, then treat them like human beings and teach them the way you want to them to learn. So they were still better off than the Democrats at that time, or more likely the South in general, not just Democrats, but the majority of Democrats, I suppose. But they still weren't quite all the way there.
Yeah, and so the Democrats, as you mentioned, Ben, you know, at this time, they are not pro African American suffrage, or really, they're really not addressing this head on in the way that I think any sensible American would see now, or any sensible human being. You had Democrats in the North, and they're saying, hey, let's restore these southern states unconditionally. They need to be just brought back in. We do not support African American suffrage. Why? Well, it's purely political, because it might threaten Democratic control in the South.
Right. Absolutely. So that's kind of a little overview of the 3/4 major opinions as far as the political parties went. And really what we're talking about this impacting is the way that construction or Reconstruction happens. And we'll start off, we can talk about Johnson and his plan for presidential Reconstruction. We talked a little bit about his kind of 3 overarching points, which didn't all work out for him very well. But it starts out pretty much with Johnson coming up with his own plan because he has no other choice, because Congress isn't in session at the moment. So Johnson pretty much says, okay, everybody, you're back. Thanks for coming. We appreciate it. Go ahead and do your own thing. And then we're just going to go ahead and say you're part of the United States again. So, all right, cool.
Yeah. So Johnson's first Reconstruction actions, he actually had 2 proclamations, and his cabinet was like, yeah, let's do this. and one of them recognized the Virginia government. And then the second one said, hey, all you ex-rebels, you're off the hook. All right. Unless you're a property owner and that property is valued at $20,000 at more. So they appointed a temporary governor for North Carolina, and they said, hey, you can have elections. But guess what, Ben?
What's that?
Neither of the proclamations that were made had any provisions regarding black suffrage or freedmen's rights. So the president was like, okay, states' rights. I'm going to order constitutional conventions in all the other southern states and have at it.
Yeah, and this really, I mean, this whole philosophy where he's kind of almost laissez-faire just creates even more issues because, like I said, he just kind of said, okay, make your own things up, and now you're part of the Union again. And in the meantime, southern states are like, we should do this thing where African-American laborers are former slaves, or they're not going to be slaves anymore, but they're going to be laborers on these annual contracts, and they're not allowed to quit. And law enforcement can arrest them for pretty much anything they want to, and then they can rent out their labor because they're prisoners, so it doesn't matter. And so you start getting basically slavery after slavery is no longer really technically allowed.
Right. And you had Southerners being elected to Congress who were former members of the Confederacy. Like in Georgia, they had the senator who was actually the former vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens. And it's like, okay, weren't we just fighting against you?
Yeah, don't we hate you?
And so it's just crazy. Now, Congress refused to seat a lot of these Southern legislators, and they appointed committees to, go back and say, hey, we need to rethink this. But there was just a lot of, bitterness. This is only, months and years after people are being slaughtered.
Right.
And here we're supposed to work together. So the Republicans in all of this, they were fearing that these Southern states were going to go back to Democrat, and it's just a bad situation.
Yeah.
And it all comes down to politics.
Right. Exactly. Nobody really considers the feelings or rights or whatever you want to call it of the people who are most impacted by these things. And so we're going to skip over a lot of stuff here, but things got pretty contentious between Congress and President Johnson at this point. Not that they were ever great, but they continue getting bad. And so he vetoes a Civil Rights Act. He is pretty much opposed, though he doesn't come right out and say it, to the 14th Amendment. It actually gets put up for ratification by the different states, and as the states are saying, yes, we're cool with that, he's supposed to announce it, and he won't. So Congress has to pass this law that says you've got to announce it because that's your job, and then you've got to do it within 10 days of finding out. So he waits like 9 days, 23 hours, 59 minutes, and is like, okay, they accepted it. So things just don't get better, and he's just really contentious with the majority of people. And so it starts to get around the time for the primaries, and we'll get into that in the next episode.
Yeah, so I can't imagine what it would be like. I
said primaries, and I totally meant convention.
Okay.
Yeah, but you get what I mean.
So as we're moving into the time to be reelected, and as he's thinking about that, because that is the third prong to Johnson's goals. Can you imagine what it would have been like if Johnson had Facebook? The guy is pretty narcissistic.
Selfies all day long.
Yeah, I'm thinking he's doing this and doing that. And he's just like, he's really taking the bull by the horns, but it's really not the bull that anybody wants the horns to be taken by, right. if that makes sense. So, he's pretty much doing his own thing. And it's kind of interesting because Congress is trying to deal with this guy, and they actually passed this Tenure of Office Act to keep cabinet members because he's like, you're fired. And Congress is like, hey, whoa,
we need them.
So, and I know it happened. I believe it happened even with Edwin Stanton, his Secretary of War. There was a lot of disagreement there with him, and actually out of this, I need to keep this guy around because I respect him, but I really disagree with him.
Right.
And he was a Lincoln holdover, like much of the cabinet was. What are we going to do? Or I should say, what am I going to do? And so Congress, they're saying, you can't fire cabinet members. And,
right.
It was pretty crazy.
Yeah, and it gets to the point, and by the way, Stanton, he's working in cahoots with General Grant, who will come into play here pretty big time soon. But Congress says you can't do that. And then Andrew Johnson's like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to fire Edwin Stanton. And so Congress basically says, well, I guess we're just going to impeach you.
That's a great idea.
I mean, what else are you going to do at that point? And so that's exactly what they do. They move for impeachment. He's the first one that actually has that motion made on him, the first president. Mm-hmm. And it ends up failing. They don't actually convict him of anything. Did they even actually impeach him, or was it just brought to a vote? I don't.
Yeah, he was impeached. And of course, he wasn't convicted. But This is kind of interesting because the only reason why he wasn't convicted, again, totally a political thing, because the Senate was like, well, the pro tem who would be the next in succession. Right. So just to back up just a little bit, nobody became vice president when Andrew Johnson became president. So the Senate pro tem was the next in line. He was a senator from Ohio, Senator Wade. He was a radical Republican.
Right.
So the rest of the Senate was like, well, if we convict the president and he's out of here, we've got this radical who is going to just completely reverse everything that we think should happen and everything Johnson thinks should happen. Right. So they're like, okay, well, we can put up with this guy for a few more years, right?
I suppose in worst case scenario, they would, but it's kind of funny because what they're doing is saying, well, we're going to put you on trial for impeachment or we're going to impeach you and put you on trial for not doing what you're supposed to do. And in the process, they were not doing what they were supposed to do by letting him just do whatever he needed to do for the sake of politics. So what goes around comes around, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. And what we actually end up having is one of the worst corrupt governments in our history. And it's kind of interesting, Ben, because we had before Lincoln, James Buchanan.
Right. Who probably is the only one that most people say beats out Johnson for worst president ever.
Yeah. And then you got Lincoln, who a lot of people say, oh, that's my favorite president. Mm-hmm. And then you got this guy, Johnson. Yeah. So no offense to our friends in Tennessee. You know, we've really tried to give Old Hickory props. You know, Andy Jack. We spoke really well of him. You know, he's a kind of a favorite son. But that other son, Andrew Johnson.
Yeah.
Boy.
Hey, so we'll come back to Andrew Johnson's, here's a spoiler for you, to Andrew Johnson's end of term in the next episode. And we'll also revisit that guy named Grant, right?
Yeah, we got to talk about him, right?
Absolutely.
And is he buried in Grant's tomb?
Ooh, who is? All right, I think that's everything for this episode. Jason, do you have anything else?
Well, if you have 30 seconds, and obviously you do have a little bit of time on your hands, you've been listening to us.
If you're driving right now, you can ignore this. Like, just pause it and wait till you get where you're going, and then resume right here.
Yeah. Okay. So for those of you who are still on the line, or if you were driving, welcome back.
Thanks.
Hey, don't forget, we are on social media. We're on Twitter at Election College. We're over on the Facebook at Election College, and also Instagram. And if you do have those 30 seconds available, head on over to iTunes and leave us a rating and a comment. We really appreciate it and helps get our show in front of more people just like you.
Yeah, seriously, when you go out to eat, do you look at the reviews if you've never been there before? Yeah. What if everybody was just like you and never left a review? How would you feel?
Not to make you feel guilty, but
do it.
Yeah.
All right, everybody, this is Ben.
And this is Jason.
Thank you very much for listening.
See you next time.